We've heard from a number of cluster members, cluster facilitators, cluster consultants, but one of the essential parts of a cluster is the involvement of research institutions. And so this afternoon we have Dr. David Ireland of CSIRO on his view of CSIRO collaborating with clusters. So can I welcome David Ireland?
And it's a real privilege to get to speak to you all today. Normally when I'm talking about clusters or precincts, I find I'm in a somewhat hostile room with people questioning my motivations. So it's nice to be able to talk to the converted today and just speak about some of the journey and that we're going through and talk about what we've been learning. So I wanted to start with some context first, and we work in the innovation system, and when we think about Australia's innovation system, Australia's got some tremendous strengths. We produce over 3% of the world's academic literature. We're close to the emerging Asian economies, but we have to remind ourselves that we're only as close to China as Germany is, so we're close to some parts of the Asian economies. For the moment, at least, our science is globally respected and competitive, and we generally have stable governments, economy and policies. But we also have some challenges that face us. 99.7% of the world's population reside outside of Australia, so it's a long way to the majority of the world's major markets. We've got a large and dispersed country, and we have some fairly significant resource and activity duplication across Australia, which poses some challenges in the efficiency and the effectiveness of how we do things. 98% of what's spent in R&D happens outside of Australia as well. And for some reason, we have this intense focus on domestic competition, often at the expense of being internationally competitive. And despite our ability to punch above our weight and be 0.3% of the world's population and produce more than 3% of the world's literature, we have this inability to translate that into products and services, as indicated by the fact that we produce less than 0.3% of the world's patents. And when we think about that in the global context, the global innovation system is also rapidly changing. With the increasing prosperity across Asia, we're facing some much stiffer competition from many Asian research organisations and industry, and just broader competition is intensifying. When you think about the challenges that we're also facing, these are also changing. Think of food security and biosecurity, population growth, and these are cross boundaries, they're cross organisations, they're cross countries and everything, and they're complex, they're interconnected, and their solutions will require cross-disciplinary and cross-organisational collaboration. And to do it will require global standing and scale. So do we have scale in Australia? Arguably no. The circle that you can't really see that's us. Like I said, we produce less than 2%. We invest less than 2% of the world's money on R&D. And when we think about standing, we also don't necessarily compete in the global standing market either. We talk about punching above our weight in academic literature, but that's only when you include the very long tail of the developing economies. The moment you start comparing us to the countries that we like to be compared against, like those in Europe, the US, even Japan, Canada, we don't compare. We're at the bottom of it anyway. So the challenge for us is, given the size of Australia, given the resources that we have at our disposal, how can we build global standing and scale that we need to remain competitive? So at CSIRO, we've been faced with this challenge for quite a while, being a lever of government, being a mechanism of government to respond to some of the science and innovation challenges facing Australia. We've been faced with the real situation of not having enough resources and not having enough capabilities to do everything that we need on our own. So we've been going through this process of co-locating with our research partners in an effort to pull resources together and do stuff that we can't do on our own. And just in a mere physical sense, when you don't even overlay and you don't think about the cultural changes that you need to have an effective cluster or precinct, simply being in each other's presence can increase productivity. So these are just two graphs of joint publications, co-authored publications with two of our partners. And I know publications is just one measure of output. But if you look at UQ, and we were doing about 50 or so publications per year with UQ until we co-located with them in 2003. And 10 years later, we're averaging about, in 2012 we did a bit over 200 publications with them. In 2013 will be more than that. Same with JCU. We co-located with them in 2010, and we've seen a fairly dramatic increase in the number of co-publications since. But there's a lot more, like I said, there's a lot more to co-locating than just simply physically co-locating with someone. I want to share a story with you about a study a guy called Brian Uzi did on Broadway, and some of you are probably aware of this. But he looked at all the playbills of musicals that happened in Broadway between, I think, 1890 and 1980, 1970. And was attempted to develop a model of social intimacy and to see if there are any correlations with that to the success of the play. And he found that when social intimacy was very low, when the people who were in the play didn't know each other, that there was a much more increased chance of that play failing, with the idea being that if I don't know you, I'm not particularly comfortable around you, and I'm less likely to create and be innovative. What was interesting was that he also found that when social intimacy was really high, that there was also an increased chance of failure. And that there was kind of this middle band of social intimacy where I kind of knew you and I felt comfortable enough to create, but not overly comfortable that stifled the creative process. And we see this playing out in places like Silicon Valley, where despite the fact that it costs $50,000 more per employee to be based in Silicon Valley than in other places across the States, firms continue to flock there. And they go there because it's the access they get to the networks that they wouldn't get elsewhere that provides them with lots of new information. And in science, that's a real challenge for us. There's this tendency for scientists to focus their collaborative efforts with the person who sits in the office next to them. There was speaking last night at dinner, there was a paper written a few years back that said if you're not within 30 metres of a scientist, you're almost not going to be able to collaborate with them. 30 metres is from here to the door. So, and it seems a bit, it's not particularly intuitive until you think about how networks function. And the beauty of networks is that they provide us with lots of information at a really low cost from lots of sources. So we heard earlier about the potted history of clusters in Australia, and there's been lots of efforts over the years, from the physical efforts of building clusters and precincts, the Australian Technology Park here, to some of the virtual ones about the CRCs or RDCs. But one of the challenges that we have in Australia is that we don't necessarily have the right people in the right places, and I don't mean that exclusively in a geographical sense, but also in the right businesses or the right parts of the economy. When you compare where Australia have the majority of its high degree research graduates, we have about 60% of our high degree research graduates working in higher education. When you compare that to the US, where they have about 80% of their high degree research graduates working in industry, you can start to draw some conclusions about why they are so much better at absorbing technologies into industry. They just have the right minds in the right places to take the ideas that their university sectors spit out and to turn them into products and services that the market needs. So we're trying to learn from all of these things and to build precincts of global standing and scale, which are defined geographic locations and capabilities that open up the possibilities of social contact and collaboration for researchers and for industry and government. We talk about proximity being important, but it's more than the physical part. There's got to be a cultural overlay to it. Talent is the single most important factor for us. You get the right people, and you can attract the right people, and then you can attract the right people. And then science isn't the only player. I think it's easy for us sometimes to fall back, talking from CSO, it's easy for us to fall back into focusing on science. But as an impact-focused organisation, we cannot deliver the impact without having the partners who take the products and services and deploy them in So the precincts we've been working on are in Perth, Brisbane, Canberra, Parkville and Clayton in Melbourne. I'll just quickly run through these. In Perth, it's the National Resource Sciences Precinct. It was launched about 2 months ago by the Federal Minister. And the goal is to be the leading minerals and energy research development centre and a key influencer globally. And we're working with UWA, Curtin, industry, federal and WA government. And I've heard the chair, it's an independent industry chair of that steering committee, and I've heard him say that it doesn't matter where you are in the world, if you're thinking about doing anything in resources beyond just digging it up out of the ground, we want you to think of Perth. Whether you're someone who's wanting to be a PhD student, whether you're an industry looking for expertise, we want this place to be the centre of the world of resource sciences. In Brisbane, it's around eco-sciences, with the goal being to build the world's largest environmental services hub, a sciences hub solving the nation's critical environmental challenges and opportunities. And we're working with UQ, QT, Griffith. We're co-located with a number of Queensland Government departments. And we're in the process of scoping phase 2 of that, which will involve some more significant industry presence. In Clayton, which is southeast Melbourne, it's around Australian manufacturing materials. Something like 20% of Australia's manufacturing happens in that broader region, so we're trying to leverage those that concentration of capabilities, and the goal is to be a hub for a wider network of industry and research-based organisations to connect, collaborate and focus on translating research outcomes to industry. And we've got some terrific partnerships with Monash University, Australian Synchrotron, the Melbourne Nanofabrication Facility. We're also working with Meta and other industry associations to bring together the various capabilities around that region. In Parkville, which is also in Melbourne, I think if there's a functioning precinct anywhere that we're working in, it's in Parkville. There's 10,000 researchers that are just doing unbelievable work. From the various medical research institutes like the Brain Institute and WeHi, to Bio21 and Uni Melbourne. They've got CSL and a host of startups there, and we're working with federal and state governments as well. The challenge, I think, that Parkville is facing is not so much attracting the right people or getting the right organisations involved, but it's about taking that next step and getting the organisations to share strategy and to start making some really informed decisions about, well, I will focus on this and you focus on that. And finally, in Canberra, it's about natural and environmental sciences, and the goal is to bring together the best people from research, government and industry to provide transformational solutions for food security, natural resource management and bioeconomy. And we're working with ANU, the federal and state governments, and industry like Bayer and Syndey and others. The challenge with Canberra is that there's not a natural industry presence. We've got a lot of virtual connections with industry, but it's hard to bring them physically on site. So what have we learned? That like I said, people are critical. If you don't get the right people to start with, you're not going to get the right people that you need to do the science or whatever it is that you want to do. But it's not just about getting the right people in terms of the science they want to do, but you also need them to be champions for collaboration. And that's often hard. There's this natural tendency, I think, for us to compete, particularly across organisations, but even within organisations, between institutes within university, between divisions within CSIRO. So you need to get the right people and incentivise them to display the right types of behaviour to do what you need them to do. And collaboration and sharing at and across multiple levels. And we're making sure that there's not just researcher to research collaboration, but also at that organisational level, across sectors and disciplines. And it needs to be actively encouraged and managed, and that goes from the very top, from the chief executives right down to the researchers. And we're also thinking about the fact that the precinct really needs to be a microcosm of the innovation system. So you've got all the relevant parties and partners within the precinct, you just can't do what you need to do. You talk about the gap, when you're trying to move a piece of IP along that innovation value chain, you want to minimise that gap each time as much as you can. it decreases your cost, it increases your speed to market. And if you've got representatives from across that value chain having coffee together, walking from the bus stop to work together, you just increase your chance of people sharing ideas and knowledge and working together. And the last one is to build on your existing strengths. All of these were not just randomly picked on a map and said we're going to do resources in Perth, we're going to do manufacturing in Melbourne. We sat back and we looked at, well, where do we think Australia has a natural competitive advantage in terms of sectors and disciplines? Where do we think these are physically based? And let's just make future investment decisions to build on those. And that's all I have. Thanks very much.
Is there people who might like to ask?
I'll go if I can, David. It may not be a very sensible question. From a cluster's point of view, finding the right universities to collaborate with and support for their innovations and R&D requirements and so on. It's really hard, especially when the cluster's territorial, based.
Yeah.
And so if you use SEQ as an example, you'll have UQ saying, well, you have to come to us, or Griffith saying, no, it's got to be us, and blah. Is there any chance that CSIRO could be a neutral broker for the R&D in the country flowing through to the clusters, the competitive clusters? Because there's almost a need for this sort of brokerage, and pulling from international, of course, too, not just within the country, but there's a need for it because it becomes extremely tense and competitive within a regional environment.
Yeah, that's a silly question. So look, one of our pillars is to act. The government expects us to play that role across the system. If you look back in the 2008 Cutler Review on Innovation, the Australian Innovation System, we were identified as one of those organisations that fills the hole in the donut. And we've got a couple of mechanisms that we try to do that. We've got the Flagship Collaboration Fund, which is about a $20 million fund that we control, that responds to industry and tries to bring in the capabilities from across the innovation system to solve those challenges. And we also have an SME engagement centre that I know some of you have worked with our guys. That works on behalf of the system. Again, I think there's about 12 of the 12 managers within that centre, and they spend their days working with SMEs across Australia and working with them to understand what their research needs are. And then they come back into CSIRO and say, do we have that capability? If not, they go out and look in the university sector and say, do you have it? And then they connect that up to industry.
Okay. Well, that sounds like an open door to me. And I wonder if we could do a deal here today whereby the 30 Australian clusters that we have listed with the Competitiveness Institute based in Australia are linked through CSIRO to the appropriate research, R&D and university institutes. Do it if we could today. I know Richard is in a position to talk to, would it be you, to then organise for that to happen. Anyway, sorry,
absolutely.
I'm pushing.
Any other questions? Great.
My name's Liz Beach. I'm from Regional Development Australia ACT. I'm also the chair of a industry cluster initiative around renewable energy in our region. We're currently looking to transition to form a renewable energy industry cluster, and I'm just wondering whether that would fit in with what you were talking about that you're doing in Canberra now. We work with the ANU Energy Change Institute and NICTA and CSIRO through Alberto Ciccolini and Geoscience Australia, that's DISOL, and obviously we have a lot of industry on board, ACT government, New South Wales government, federal government. So yeah, I'm just wondering if that's appropriate on a more one-to-one level.
Yes and no. Well look, I mean, the decisions for where we're basing our precincts aren't we're not stopping doing research that's ongoing there. We're not stopping. As those people leave, we might make decisions to restaff those roles based somewhere else. But if you're working with someone in CSIRO at Black Mountain, then you will continue to work with them at Black Mountain, and you'll get all the support that you need. But the fact of the matter is that our focus in oil and gas and resources will be in Perth and in Brisbane, and the focus in energy is in Newcastle.
So do you have another cluster in Newcastle?
We do. For people who've worked with CSIRO, they won't be surprised. We have a hierarchy of clusters, of precincts. We have ones that we think that compete on the global stage, and they're the ones I spoke about. But we also have those that we're calling national precincts or centres, and that's what the centre in Newcastle is. It's an energy. We're working with University of Newcastle and a number of industry partners there to build that. But the focus more in Canberra is around the bioeconomy. So we do have some biofuels work that happens there, and if you're working with ANU, they have some significant capabilities as well.
They do. But talking about changing and adapting to the current environment, at the moment there's not much happening in the rest of Australia in renewable energy. However, in our region, driven by the ACT government's 90% renewable energy, and what's happening around that, there's a lot of renewable energy activity happening in our region. So it's an appropriate place to work with renewable energy. So I'll leave that with you.
I might just add that clusters like Copenhagen Clean Tech Cluster are very aggressive globally. Hook up with them, you hook up into Mazda, you hook up into Singapore, and you're hooking up into Shanghai immediately, and they love coming to Australia. Any other questions?
And you can hook up with our guys in Newcastle as well.
Right.
So, yeah.
How do you decide what criteria to use to work with overseas organisations, research, China, States,
Yep.
partner with them?
That's a good question, and it can be a tricky one because we have to provide value back to the Australian taxpayer, where we get 60% or so of our budget is direct appropriation. And we're a government agency, and so we have to be doing work that's responding to national challenges. And so there's various criteria around when we work offshore and how we work offshore. We have to be able to draw a direct line back into benefit to Australia, and that may be benefit through. We take Australian SMEs with us when we're deploying our capabilities overseas. It might also be that by working with the partner overseas, we're developing new capabilities ourselves that we can then come and deploy back in Australia. We don't do work just for making money. So it doesn't matter how much money they're going to give us. If we cannot draw a line back to how is this benefiting Australia, we're not going to do it. Which is a little funny because if someone's going to give us a whole pile of money, maybe that's a benefit to Australia as well. But it's not something that we do.
Thank you.
Margaret Blade from RDA Brisbane. In Brisbane we've got the Hurston Health and Medical Sciences Precinct, and as Tracy mentioned, they've got the Asia Pacific Centre for Neuromodulation and probably a lot of other sort of world-class facilities there.
And the CSIRO eHealth research.
Okay, and I know that they ideally sort of aspire to be another Parkville in terms of attracting research dollars and the top brains of the world and all that sort of thing. So to what extent can sort of a smaller sort of precinct like that leverage off something like Parkville when they're sort of in competition with each other, but what sort of support I suppose is there?
I reckon Brisbane has got enormous potential in the health and medical research space, particularly because of the Translational Research Centre and the fact that they can go from a researcher developing stuff at the bench to it being trialled in a patient to it being manufactured by, I can never remember the company's name, DMI or whatever it is. That's something that the Translational Research Institute is unique in Australia. And the money that Chuck Feeney through Atlantic Philanthropies poured into Brisbane, and built the Queensland Brain Institute and the IMB and the ARBN, and also the TRI has just given Brisbane a real boost in its capacity. I think the challenge for Brisbane is to somehow connect those precincts that are forming, which is the PA Hospital, the Bogger Road, Dutton Park precinct, the Kelvin Grove urban village, and the Kelvin Grove, the Hurston precinct, and I think it's that knowledge corridor that I know you guys talk about. If you're able to somehow connect those, and that'll include that, that'll have to involve some, public transport and ease of mobility for people to get between those precincts. But I think if you can do that, you can really pull together some really interesting cross-disciplinary capabilities that nowhere else in Australia is able to do at the moment.
David, one of the problems that I can see in Australia is that we have a lot of universities and a lot of research teams, and in many cases we don't have enough critical mass to overcome the thing. Belgium, with the same population, has 4 universities. We have 38. Now, I can understand politically we're well spread out compared to Belgium, but we really have this problem of critical mass. And how can we overcome? We can overcome that by communication, but as you say, most people want to work with someone within 30 metres of them. Yeah. How do we overcome that problem?
I don't know. That's a a policy issue. I know that places like there's a university that's been established in Paris called something like, for the French speakers in the room, I apologise, but it's something like Paris Saint Clair or something. And that is an umbrella university that's been built to sit on top of 3 universities in Paris with the express intention of turning 3 subcritical mass universities into something that will be top 20 worldwide. And so they're all published under the same name now. They've got similar governance structures. And so we could think about doing that, but not commenting on policy, recent discussions around the deregulation of the university system will potentially work against that, and we'll end up with more universities of even smaller scale. I think part of the challenge is that we've got a lot of universities want to do everything, I think, like I was talking about, I think we need to focus. Australia's just not big enough to do everything everywhere. And we need to make some really informed decisions about what can we be best at and what do we need to be the best at, and just focus our investments and efforts in those.
Well, thank you very much. We come to the last presentation today, and it's appropriate. It's from Regional Australia, and we have Mark Bell from RDA Riverlands and Maryland. So without further ado, I'll give you Mark.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the opportunity of perhaps sharing my experience over the last 2 years. I'm very new to the clustering space. I heard E4 talk at a RDA conference in the Barossa Valley 2 years ago, and that started my clustering journey. It's been a rather eventful one over the 2 year period. Today I'm going to attempt to share some of my learnings, but at the same time ask you some questions and so some questions that perhaps we can have a discussion about at the end, about some of my challenges and some of my issues that I have. I guess I'm last, but I'm also going to shift the discussion from top down and some intellectual discussions to bottom up, grassroots, how do we actually make clusters happen in regions. And unlike some of our predecessor speakers, I come from a rather small region, so I can't brag about having universities and ports and stuff in our region. However, every region I think has some value, and in our particular region, which is about 80-kilometre region in radius, we grow 20% of Australia's almonds and 25% of Australia's wine output. So each region, I'm sure, is able to find something that they can excel at. Why am I here? Well, like I said, I listened to E4 talk about clusters and thought, this is a really good way for regional development and economic development in the regions. So I had a couple of interactions with E4, and then one of the guys from the State Government Department rang me up in January and said to me, Mark, I think you should apply for a Churchill Fellowship, because we don't have any money and we don't really have any resources, but we really need to get some expertise and find out what's happening. I said to him very quickly, I think you've rang the wrong number. Long story short is he managed to convince me to do that. I was successful. I'd like to thank the Australian Institute of Management for sponsoring my Churchill Fellowship, and I'd really encourage, I know there's at least one other Churchill Fellow in the room, and I'd really encourage any of you that are passionate, and that's the thing I think that they looked at was, I don't come from a education background, but I think they're looking for people who are passionate about what they're on about, and I'd encourage any of you, especially around the cluster exercise, to think and seriously consider about perhaps applying for that in the 2014. I think that opens later on this year. One of the things that I'm a country bumpkin. I come from a fairly sheltered background, and one of the things that came to, in my understanding about my visit to Europe, was that the whole of Europe except Russia fits into Australia. So when you listen to all the speakers talk about Europe and what they're doing in Europe and how they're exporting and how they're doing all this cross-border sort of information, when you think about it, the logistics of Australia versus Europe, the whole of Europe fitting into Australia, it just changed the way I thought about some of the challenges that we've got in Australia. Now, my overseas experience was pretty full on. I spent 6 weeks visiting 6 countries. I did the TCI conference. Like I said, I'm very new to this. Again, those of you that are serious about clustering, I would encourage you to go to Mexico to the TCI conference. I made a lot of good contacts. There's a couple of people in the clustering field, including E4, that have looked after me fairly well. And every now and again I get a tap on the shoulder to say, I think you should actually come and talk to this bloke, and he did it to me again last night. And there are a lot of people in this space that are quite good at doing that sort of thing, and I'm now attempting to repay that favour by trying to introduce people to other people that might get some benefit out of it. I visited a whole array of people in overseas. I was very conscious of the fact that I didn't have much to give and I was going to take a fair bit. Mixed with some fantastic like-minded people, and there's some newbies to the clustering thing that I've spoken to today, and they've said it's nice to actually sit in a room with like-minded people rather than being challenged. And I think David said the same thing when he was speaking just a minute ago, that it's nice to talk to people that are converted rather than people that are continuing to challenge. They were all happy to be challenged by my questions. I came back with so much information, and the question was, how am I actually going to make a difference from where I'm situated? And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as we go along. One of the things that that happened to me was, on the way home, I was reading a magazine, and the bit on read here, only consider partnering or collaborating in those areas in which you cannot be the most effective on your own, really resonated with me. From my point of view, my job is to engage people at a basic cluster level. So you've got to find something that they're prepared to engage in. And so that became a really good filter for a lot of the stuff and activities that I was doing. And I guess I went away with the question of, what can I do from the ground up? What can I learn that would make it easier for us to improve what we're doing at a regional level in formulating and encouraging clusters to work? My answer to that was collaboration. And in my review, I identified 4 different levels of players in the cluster market. Now, this is all my own interpretation. I only have 2 years' experience, so I may well have missed something, but pretty much there's government, universities and knowledge institutions, regional organisations and businesses and the clusters themselves. And I was quite perplexed when I was writing my report that, what can we do, how can we go about it? And I had a conversation with Richard and Tracy, and I said, we've got all these people, and I know all these different people, and I know some of the people that are in the room here. They're all passionate about clustering and they can see the benefits in it, but we don't get together, we don't actually collaborate ourselves, and that's, I think, probably the seed for today. And I guess what I'd really like to flag as a question for a discussion afterwards is what ideas we have amongst us that we can formulate a way of communicating and collaborating better than we currently do. I've suggested perhaps a state, national and Asia Pacific level type collaboration. I'm reasonably comfortable that we may have the makings in South Australia, which is where I'm from, to start to formulate that. I'm not sure where everybody is in other states, but that's something that perhaps we could have a discussion on about at the end of my conversation. The other thing that became really obvious while I was away, and like I said, I went from a bottom-up point of view, and I became quite disillusioned as I started to talk to people that without a top-down component, which I had absolutely no control over, it really wasn't going to happen. And I think that's probably been expressed a little bit today from previous speakers. So the hourglass approach needs to happen. We need to have some top-down stuff. Again, it's outside of my control, but it needs to be there. But the one thing that I'd really like to talk about is, and it's way out of my field. I've only ever spent 1 day in university, and that was on a training course. So this is way out of my field. But there appears to be a need for reform where research is more based on industry rather than pure research. Now, when I was overseas in Sweden, they had the same problem. Steel guys were complaining that the university had just invented a new steel that they couldn't cut, drill, bend, or whatever. And the university's answer was, we can't do anything yet. Home here at a local level, at my level, the arm industry done some wonderful innovation and reduced the amount of inputs with water and chemicals and nearly more than doubled their output. And like I said in my beginning, almonds and wine were the 2 big industries. The wine industry said, well, we'd like to replicate what the almond industry have done with their inputs, and went to the universities to try and engage them in a project, and the answer was, sorry, we can't do that. There's no paper in that. And I guess that's part of the issue, and one of the previous speakers, I think might have been David, said 80% of America's research guys are involved in industry. I don't know how we fix that, but I definitely think it's an issue and it needs to be addressed. I went away from a bottom-up point of view, and I was looking for ways that I could leverage my activity at a local level on how to engage businesses. And also, I got the understanding that it's all well and good for us as practitioners to go along and say, we need businesses to engage, it needs to be industry driven, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, the only way we can get business to engage is because they choose to. We've got to find a way for them to make a positive choice. I wrote up a report. It took me a long time for my Churchill Fellowship. I sent it off to E4 about 1 day before it was supposed to be published. He said, Mark, you've got something really wrong with this. You just haven't quite grasped a couple of the terminologies. And what I had done was use the words of cluster initiative and project as the same thing. So, and a few of the people that have spoken today, I said they had trouble getting their head around it. So this is my attempt to get my head around the terminology. So we've talked about clusters being a naturally occurring thing. So from a regional point of view, we need to be able to identify what clusters might be potentially out there, and some of those are not obvious. And I found that in northern Spain when I was there, they had a big wine growing area. They had no wine growing cluster because they didn't get industry engagement. And yet one of the other very small industries is now a rather large industry because they were able to identify it. The cluster initiative, most of the speakers today have talked about those that have been actively involved, have been in and around it for a long time, they're formed. Some of the cluster initiatives that I've been involved in or have been associated with are very informal. The RDA that I work with, we have two physical regions that are about 200 kilometres apart. We both started a food and wine cluster in both of those regions. The other region, they are going to formalise their structure, where in my region, the guys didn't want to formalise, but they've actually created two activities, or they've got the third point down there, they've formed some theme networks, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So you're quite familiar with the formal ones, but there's also an informal network in Adelaide. There's an IT network that's been formed in Adelaide that really is shying away from any sort of formalisation, any sort of recognition by government. They don't want any funding. But they can send out an email and put 300 or 400 people in the town hall. Most of those people are sleeping on somebody else's couch. So they've built a really good cluster without actually having any formalisation at all, and they're getting some pretty good outcomes. One of my proposals is, and while this isn't bulletproof, and again it's hoping to generate some discussion, is I spent some time with Max Williams, and he and Irene Seville put together a book, Building the Cluster Commons, and I'd like to explore that and I've come up with some ideas, and again I'd be happy with some feedback. But from a regional perspective, I'll get that in a minute. I guess some of the things that I would envisage a cluster commons vehicle would do would be to create some clusters and help facilitate them for a period of time. But the two things that I really came back from overseas with that I think were really important was a lot of clusters I visited had a dedicated HR person. One of them had been going for 8 years and had just put somebody in that position. They wished they'd done that 7 or 8 years ago. So, and a lot of it's about change thinking, about thought leadership, especially at regional level. There's a challenge there. And something else that I learned, and it's probably the most important lesson I learned, and a few people have mentioned today, is promoting what you're doing. Speaking about it loudly, promoting what's happening around, keeping the network or the cluster informed about what's going on. So that's a critical role, and it's quite often overlooked, and it needs to be funded in some way, shape or form. Quickly. All right. What I might do, because of time, is I'll skip over these. I guess cluster mapping in conjunction with locals. Analyse potential clusters. One thing I really did want to make a mention of is one of the things I learned down in the southeast of South Australia. They've got timber processing down there. They're looking at all the different innovations with timber. I'd like to think that when the clusters are identified, that some research is done into papers that have been published around those particular subjects, so that the businesses have got some ideas on what they might be able to do with their cluster work. Another thing that I'd like to challenge you on is shifting from supply chain thinking to value chain thinking, and maybe that forces a collaboration that wouldn't otherwise have happened. Establishing networks around a common issue, ensuring cross-disciplinary participation and leadership, and making connections. I really wanted to talk about this at length, but I'll try and cut it short. This is at a local level. The HR network, for those of you that are in regional development, we started to talk to the businesses involved, and one of the things that happened was they started talking about hidden jobs. They had trouble promoting their regions, and the question we asked was, if you could find the right person tomorrow, how many jobs would you have that are currently not being advertised? Now, we asked 16 businesses, they had 33 full-time jobs, $1.68 million in wages, and an average job of 50 grand. So they're significant jobs. So when you're looking at regional development and employment, that's something that, and the markets don't take care of themselves. So we've got an energy group that's put together, and they have got 13 organisations. They spend $20 million on energy. They got a 3% reduction in costs, and they're a lobbying vehicle. So again, it's a reason for them to engage in the first place. A couple of speakers have talked about building an ecosystem. Clusters promote the human potential of the region. They sell the region. So there's lots of things along those lines. I guess the challenge that I really wanted to ask was, is a cluster commons that fits in regional areas over a number of individual clusters something that we could consider and could work? I know in Ethel's book there's a Czech place, now probably just in your memory, but there is a model overseas where there is a body that sits over a number of different clusters and provides services to that group of clusters. So like the HR and the PR might be spread over a number of clusters rather than funded by an individual cluster. Thank you for listening, and if you've got any questions?
Thank you, Mark. Do we have any questions? Any comments?
It's a shame it's so rushed, mate. There's a whole lot of stuff there. There's so much stuff. Sorry, could you just expand, Mark, just a little bit on your cluster commons concept, whether you're, could that be a commercial concept, like a not-for-profit, but, you know, what are you thinking there?
What I was hoping was that we could get a model up and running where each region has probably a two-person operation that is funded in the short term to get these clusters up and running. So I don't envisage it to be a bit like the HunterNet type thing where it's a paid model. And I think from a regional point of view, they would focus on the larger type clusters first. So the food and wine cluster in our region turns over $650 million. It's got larger businesses. It's more likely to become a self-funding model in the longer term, where some of the smaller clusters probably need ongoing support. So, but getting economies of scale for the clusters within the region, because there'll be, if you've got 4 or 5 clusters in a region, there'll be some larger players and some smaller players in that, and providing some joint services.
You're probably aware, we might talk later, we set up Innovate Centre on the Central Coast, New South Wales, to do exactly that. So that's what we're actively doing at the moment. So,
and that's been successful?
Yeah. Yes, but like any new venture, and that's what a cluster really is, it goes through crisis points, and it has to build a foundation and continue to build that. And like HunterNet, which we talked about before, it's always a going concern that you actually have to nurture, keep building, and you never take it for granted. So, but that's probably a good indication of what you're saying. So we've done that. Graham Bacon from the IRC was, you know, the catalyst in that project with myself. So to actually do what you're talking about.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Comments? Well, thank you, Mark. We'll now start to get some input from you. Okay, we've had a conference today where we've discussed a lot of issues on clusters, and our question is, what do you want to do next? What are your needs? What training needs do you think you need in Australia? Do we develop a regional development model like Mark has been suggesting? How do we do that? How do we ensure that we communicate better? And are you interested in having another similar conference in, say, 6 months' time? Is this the sort of thing you'd like to do? We could start up a LinkedIn group. There are LinkedIn groups that we all belong to, but we could start a specifically Australasian one to involve us all, so we could share our stories and questions, etc., across Australia. Yeah.
I've just got a suggestion for being the RDA, is that, I can be loud, okay, is that it would be good to be put on sort of the RPAC and Regional Development Australia agenda, that each RDA picked a specialty as a cluster. So, you know, this is, we keep going back to our regions and our states, but if we're going to talk about a national cluster, it would be a good agenda item to be circulated on the RDA agendas. Is that format already set?
No.
You want to say? Yes. Yeah.
Go for it.
Thanks. Not to just to follow on from your comment in terms of the linkage to RDAs themselves, is just perhaps to be aware that the RDAs, all 55 of us there throughout Australia, are different in everything that they do. For example, in our region, Far North Queensland and Torres Strait, which covers an enormous area about the size of Victoria, that they don't do anything with clusters at all. It's us at Advanced Cairns who actually have the cluster management role, similarly to the Central Coast and the others. So,
Get on the agenda.
yes.
Not necessarily pick exactly what that cluster may look like, but if we're going to raise awareness of clustering and how we look at this, it's an agenda of 52 RDAs and something to nationally look at, not necessarily picking which ones. I might say, I'm not going to have one, we're not going to do it. But I just think there's a format rather than reinventing more wheels that has.
Okay, well, if I can pick up on that, given that I'm from an RDA and all of the others here today who are from RDAs, I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say about that. Would you agree with that idea, support that initiative? I mean, myself, I think RDAs are a perfect platform to start pulling these things together. Just to have that platform to communicate across the country and to raise the cluster agenda, you know, in regional Australia. I would think so.
We've actually got the conference, it only went on the website yesterday morning, the rda.gov.au, which is a news feed that every RDA member and committee member and staff sort of across Australia has access to. And we'll do a follow-up of the outcomes of this conference on there as well. And also Tracy's present at the Regional Development Conference in Albury in October about the outcomes of this conference and, you know, some of the key.
Yeah, so
key
although
things as well.
I entirely agree with you that there are other organisations out there who are actually leading the charge in their regions with cluster programs, the RDAs are a great link across the country, across the nation to communicate that information or step in perhaps where a region is lacking in that other bit of infrastructure to pull the cluster agenda
Well, at least
together.
update the database that we were talking about earlier in the segment.
Absolutely, yes, exactly. So I suppose we can take that as a let's get out to the RDAs and see if they're interested. Indeed, that would also require inviting RDAs to learn more about clusters, because we have, 10 here today. There's 55 of them, so there's an awareness raising role there too.
Can I suggest that maybe you might think about a workshop on clusters at the RDA National Conference? I don't know whether that's possible.
Yeah, well, we don't know if there's an RDA National Conference anymore, but yeah, we'll put that down on the
I thought Margaret was saying there was one.
Oh,
Oh, no, that's a separate regional development conference.
Aubrey.
Oh, yeah, in Auburn.
Yeah,
Well, maybe run one in Auburn.
Well, indeed.
Yes, that's right.
Right, so Syndey and the ribs, but I do have two comments or questions. One is to follow up on Graham Sheether's suggestion about getting the academics more involved. The Roy Green plus who else issue. I'd love to see us try and do something in that vein, and to work with those that might fund a course in cluster management, cluster training, embedded within one university or several universities. The second suggestion is investment attraction. The benefit, to my mind, of clusters is to tell people outside Australia or in other parts of Australia that there are hotspots, and we've never really maximised that. I raised it with Austrade 5 years ago as to whether they could start putting clusters on their website, investment attraction website. And they looked at me and I thought, they just didn't get it. I'd love to revisit that. So I'm all for RDA committees getting into this. And also, I guess what I'm saying is for an approach to be made to Austrade. It was great today to hear about the work being done on mapping clusters. Hunter Tech I lost track of. I mean, that's powerful stuff, and that should be on investment attraction websites. I guess the third thing is business migration. Ray behind me is, I'll pass it over to him if you want to talk about it, but I think it's a fascinating opportunity to get business migration programs involved in clusters. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I've just arrived here. I met some of you last night, but I'm Ray Turner. I'm an immigration lawyer, and I live on the Central Coast. There's a big opportunity at the moment with an investment program where overseas investors can bring $5 million upwards into Australia. And if you like, they can buy themselves residence here. But all of that money is going into the capital cities, whereas in my experience, these people will put the money anywhere that is recommended to them. The money they're going to put in isn't the money that they're going to use. They will buy security for their families and their funds for that $5 million, and then they'll spend whatever else they've got elsewhere. So what we're trying to do, along with Rod's organisation, is to develop opportunities for these people in regional Australia. And then I can take it out to my international networks to bring the money in. So that's another important aspect of this that you might like to think about.
Just one comment about the universities. When I was CEO of EDA, we did a survey of the skill needs of economic development practitioners. We sent an EOI around all the 38 universities, of which we got 4 replies. We finally chose one university which started to deliver the course. Unfortunately, that university gave us an academic who was located in a regional area. He had no support whatsoever, and the whole thing fell over after about 2 years. People doing the course were very enthusiastic about the content, but there was no follow-up. People were getting their assignments a year later. It was pretty horrible, and so we gave it away. So the problem is the lack of critical mass of academics working in this field. Unless we can find a university that is prepared to do that, and they really look at numbers. The problem we had is we didn't have enough numbers. We had 15 students, and the university demanded 20 for an online course. And so we've got a real problem about finding a tertiary institution. Maybe the sort of courses that E4 and Roden have developed could be looked at being online, I'm not sure. But those are the sort of courses which are done by practitioners, which is probably what you really need. And that's not being a marketing for Roden, but those sort of courses. TCI is particularly interested in this because we have the same problem throughout the world of getting adequate cluster management courses.
That was my question, is that are there organisations or places around the world that are offering this sort of course?
Yes.
There are, but there are not very many, and a lot of them are not very practical. We have problems of intellectual property as well, that people do courses and then other people borrow them, and we're not too happy about that as well. So, but yeah, I'm at the present moment have made a list of all the webinars that are applicable, and I'm now going to talk to Roden and E4 about how we can use their courses as an opportunity.
I'd like, where's Mark gone? Mark, yeah. When I heard you yesterday or last night, you were talking, you told me a bit about this South Australian company, the cluster connectors or some, and you mentioned just before too. I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what it is they plan to do, and is there anything, that we might be able to learn from them or procure from them, or there they are. There you go. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realise you.
That's all right. So we're with DEMITA, so we're the Economic Development Agency for the state government, and we're developing a cluster coordination office to do some of that more overarching of a number of clusters. We're also
within South Australia.
Within South Australia to get up. So what we're doing is, while we're providing funds to the clusters, providing that support for cluster management as well as cluster projects that can go forward, we're also looking to ensure that we can, provide education. At the moment, not an academic education, but it's get someone like I4N to sort of train some people in those processes. Also provide some of those regular networking, sort of more across the value chain, what those problems are from a cluster perspective, and also some research. Particularly we're doing a lot of work with the ECIC at Adelaide University, which is Entrepreneurship, Commercialisation and Innovation Centre. So we were just, as this discussion was going, we were thinking that there's some potential there, because there's a few things in train that we hope will come off that will allow a bit of a sort of cluster focus for some research there.
Well, I suppose then taking the next step, my question, it sounds to me like that would be a wonderful service, or is a wonderful service that you're pulling together for clusters in South Australia. Would there be an appetite from people in this room today for a similar sort of thing to be available across the Oceania region? Because that's who we are here today. We have our New Zealand colleagues. We have a lot to learn from them, to share with them. We have the Pacific Islands, who we should be working with anyway. They're in our neighbourhood. Is there an appetite to move this conversation around the room today with people who have said they have an interest in collaborating and connecting? Would you sign on the dotted line today to try and move this up a notch and make something a little more formal? Linked, of course, because this is auspicious by TCI. We have nominally a name of TCI Oceania, but it's very much a loose idea. Is there an appetite to make something a little more formal, to perhaps learn from the sort of platform that you're setting up there in South Australia? Could
South Australia take it to COAG, and then Australia government.
Yeah. Well, what an interesting. Yeah. Thank you, Margaret. Now, I suppose can I have a raise of hands on that one? Who would agree? Would people be happy to participate in this sort of cluster commons across Australasia? Anybody no? Those who say no, hand up.
Can I just raise one thing that Rod, I think, raised? the fact is that at the Commonwealth level, we're not going to get funding in the near future. So it seems to me that the states are starting to act in a much more cooperative, collaborative way. And so maybe what our aim is to ensure that the main states, all the mainland states and perhaps Tasmania, have cluster programs in place, because otherwise I don't think we're going to get anything at the Commonwealth level.
Can I make a suggestion? 2 or 3 years ago, the CEO of the CSIRO, his name escapes me, Megan, she made a big play about the importance of clusters. And I've not been tracking it since. But it was interesting, her argument was CSIRO do a lot of research, important that they commercialise it, get closer to industry. So there's one avenue. We've also got 120 government research centres still, I think. And my dealings with a lot of those over the years have always been astounded that their business managers don't really need clusters, or there's no conscious effort for them to basically use clustering concepts in their day-to-day work. In other words, hooking up CRC researchers with their industry partners. So there's 2 themes, which gets back to, could we somehow, through Megan or Roy's Green or the scientific community, to say, hey, let's develop a course at one of the existing universities. Start small, doesn't have to be a whole cluster course, but just to start the process. And these people would then be expected to attend this course as part of their daily work. Because I've just seen it so often that they weren't embracing industry like we know they could be, like a lot of you are, through the use of your clustering techniques. That'd be my suggestion. And that's also something that you might be able to run and a federal minister or head of a department and be pulling it out of existing budgets rather than asking for $500,000 or whatever as fresh money.
Okay. I think we haven't framed the problem sufficiently. I've got a sneaking suspicion we haven't framed the problem sufficiently well, and we're jumping to solutions for it. All of these are really good ideas and thought bubbles, and we shouldn't lose them. But I think we actually have to articulate what the problem is, and like we picked up Mark's heartfelt kind of quest for meaning out of this, and to try to use our resources better and to combine shared services, all of which are good ideas. But I think we just need to think a little bit and have something on our agenda out of this that says we've got to collaborate and share knowledge better, and do that in a formal way which links to training and skills, not just picking up people who are economic development practitioners now, or regional development specialists, or cluster people. Yes, yes and yes to all of those things, but there might be other markets like CRCs or whatever. I'm a bit sceptical about that, but you know, there might be. So I think we need to nut out and frame the problem a bit more from what's happened, and then start to pick up some of these ideas and see if we can't frame a solution.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Well, perhaps what we could do is, we've already got a press release which we've circulated to the press, but we haven't circulated to you. We could start a LinkedIn group. We can send these comments you've made around for comment back, and we could do some coordination. I suppose we could talk to a couple of universities and see what, but I understand the problem of the universities providing courses like that. We could talk to E4 and Roden, because they've got a course already set up. Whether that's a practical thing to do. So,
I just, if I may, just pick up on visibility, and I think it's really important that we think about visibility and how we connect through mainstream media, and how we connect through industry associations, then back into ministers' offices, back into advisors. One thing that I've discovered through the work, whether it's being, back in Adelaide or in Scandinavia or beyond, is pulling together the cluster, its members, and getting your results on the front page of the newspaper. Interestingly, it takes a while to do, but our reports back in Adelaide were on the front pages of the Advertiser. We changed the editorial. We went from being part of the problem to being part of the solution in an area of high unemployment and social disadvantage. That was changed. And we also changed that through driving the results through the financial press, through the Australian Financial Review, getting full-page newspaper stories that then fed into things like the state reports and the Fin Review, and then it spun off into the BRW, and we even got press in China on the work that we were doing. I think it's really important. As I sat here today, I was thinking, it's so nice to be back home. So much fantastic work that's occurring. I was thinking, sorry, the CSIRO, I've just forgotten your name.
David.
Yeah, just fantastic work, and Craig with the sports stuff that's happening in Geelong, and Wollongong's rediscovering itself in terms of tech and so on. I think there is so much potential here. We need to package it up. And I think of the amazing job that Tracy and Jackie did back in Cairns in terms of the TCI conference here to showcase. And what I do know is if you build that up consistently, a small local council called the City of Playford ended up having the largest manufacturing conferences in South Australia, and ostensibly some of the largest in Australia, that was funded with almost nothing. The companies owned it, and as a result, the press came. The TV cameras came, the Prime Minister came, the financial press came. And even in Mackay, where we had something useful to talk about in terms of the cluster generating new joint ventures, we had full-page stories on Mackay in the Australian Financial Review, and a journalist was sent up there with us for 2 days from Sydney to Mackay. Who would have thought a financial journalist with the Fin Review would go to Mackay for 2 days? So, and I think of the Hunter Network, extraordinary stuff. I think we need to pull together the galvanising energy in the group to say, how do we put on something like the big TCI stuff? The conferences back in Adelaide was get 400 to 500 manufacturers coming along. We need to get that. And if we want that agenda, we have to grab it. Yeah. We do have to grab it, and we have to pick ourselves up, and we need to show people that this works. I'm going to just reinforce a point I made earlier this morning. There are fantastic people working in government departments. There's some really great people working in the Commonwealth, but they've also been gutted. And a lot of that intellectual knowledge about what we're talking about has literally walked out the door, and we're about to see another round of that with federal cuts to the departments. It's just going to be a fact of life. We need to start building that knowledge base in terms of the sorts of things that we're seeing here today, in terms of the importance, and then show the contribution that they're making to the country, and through the specific initiatives. So next time you're launching a 50, 60, 100, $200 million investment, which you regularly do, let's package it up. Let's plan for the release of that announcement. And if you package that up into big events, people will be there and be like, my God, we need to change our way of doing things. And they do, because we've experienced that through our work, and policy follows. Because policy follows good practice, because it's evidence-based. So I would encourage us to work together with the really good people in the room to just lift this whole thing up. So next time we have the TCI event here, we've got several hundred people, we've got the companies here, we've got 100 of John's amazing companies here, you know, that are going to come along and share, and they're going to make their announcements to the rest of the world about how they're developing new technologies. We're going to have the people from Geelong launching some new initiatives around sports stuff, which Australia knows. And I'm going to stop now because I'm getting excited, because that's the sort of thing we need to do.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Or we could do nothing.
Oh, absolutely.
Or we could do nothing, Roden, which is basically what we've done for the past 10 years, isn't it? To be honest. I have to say. But perhaps picking up on exactly what you're saying there, I know what I'd be excited about. I'd be excited to come back here in a year's time, go to the new building that Roy and Frank Geary are building next door, bring all those hundreds of people from our regions and actually have a proper cluster conference. Anyway, I look... and we still have some comment to come. John, I'll give you my microphone.
John Grace from the Innovative Region Centre, Enterprise Connect. Soon to be working under a new program called the Entrepreneurs Infrastructure Program. Just reflecting on Roden's comments and questions about Mark's presentation, I think also I agree that the successes of cluster development work in Australia need to be celebrated and published. But I think along with that needs to be some good scholarship about clusters in Australia. I know it's not completely non-existent, but it's not far off it. And part of this, I think, is about developing an Australian language about clusters, because it is different to Europe and the US and East Asia. And I think one of the problems we have with national government is that a lot of people in the Australian government actually don't believe that the European approach to cluster development in Australia will work. And I think a good piece of scholarship that says, well, there have been remarkable successes in Australia. They just look different, and they're done a different way. And I was a bit shocked this morning listening to some of the early presentations where it seemed to me that a lot of the fantastic work that's been going on in Australia didn't seem to be known about. And then as the days unfolded, of course, more and more it's come to attention. And it looks different. It doesn't look like French or German cluster. And the way it develops is different. So I think it's really important to get this research done and published, and in a way that's really credible to policymakers and program designers, not only in federal government. And the last thing I'd say is that while there's not huge buckets of money rolling around at the moment in this work, there's fantastic partnerships happening and continuing to start up between different levels of government and regional organisations. And that does include Commonwealth government. It's done in a very humble way, but it's done with great expertise. And while there isn't a huge amount of money floating around, we need to actually be really smart and keep talking to each other about how those partnerships can be formed and really support it. Because some of what you've heard today has happened because of that. So Australian Sports Technology Network has happened because of partnerships between industry, different levels of government, regional organisations. And it's really powerful stuff. And thanks very much to Richard and Tracy and Roden for putting this on today, because TCI is a fantastic organisation, and to have it operating here and functioning healthily in Australia is a huge step forward. So thank you.
Especially to Richard and to Tracy, who really did the hard yards. But what I find really interesting, as an Aussie, we have exported our cluster framework to Scandinavia. We're implementing it in the wind industry. We've been implementing it in clean tech. We've been implementing it in advanced manufacturing and also steel. And we've got a Kiwi here who's been translating this knowledge in terms of the learning and the potential to do this. What I find really exciting about Australia is our energy. We actually do things quickly, we cut through to the chase, we make things happen. And the sort of process and sometimes a level of sort of sclerotic sort of process within Europe that we run with it and we get it done. And I think we've got a hell of a lot to learn from the Europeans, and a part of that is the frameworks and the knowledge resources and the money they put in. But there's a whole bit about Australia of being fresh and energetic and actually getting things done, which stands us in really, really good stead. And I absolutely agree that that is us. That is what we do. We get things done. So let's be proud of that process and let's really celebrate the energy of the clusters that are in this room and around the country as well.